Medal of Honor by Mac Reynolds. Medal of Honor, Part 1. According to tradition, the man who held the Galactic Medal of Honor could do no wrong. In a strange way, Captain Don Mathers was to learn that this was true. Don Mathers snapped to attention, snapped a crisp salute to his superior, said, "Sub-Lieutenant Donald Mathers reporting, sir." The Commodore looked up at him, returned the salute, looked down at the report on the desk. He murmured, "Mathers, one-man scout V-102, Sector A22-K223. "Yes, sir," Don said. The Commodore looked up at him again. "You've been out only 5 days, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir. On the third day I seemed to be developing trouble in my fuel injectors. I stuck it out for a couple of days, but then decided I'd better come in for a check," Don Mathers added. "As per instructions, sir." Of course. In a scout you can hardly make repairs in space. If you have any doubts at all about your craft, orders are to return to base. It happens to every pilot at one time or another." "Yes, sir." "However, Lieutenant, it has happened to you 4 times out of your past 6 patrols." Don Mathers said nothing. His face remained expressionless. "The mechanics report that they could find nothing wrong with your engines, Lieutenant." "Sometimes, sir, whatever is wrong fixes itself. Possibly a spot of bad fuel. It finally burns out and you're back on good fuel again, but by that time you're also back at the base." The Commodore said impatiently, "I don't need a lesson in the shortcomings of the one-man scout, Lieutenant. I piloted one for nearly 5 years. I know their shortcomings, and those of their pilots." "I don't understand, sir." The Commodore looked down at the ball of his thumb. "You're out in space for anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, all alone. You're looking for Kraden ships, which practically never turn up. In military history, the only remotely similar situation I can think of were the pilots of World War I pursuit planes in the early years of the war, when they still flew singly, not in formation. But even they were up there alone for only a couple of hours or so." "Yes, sir," Don said meaninglessly. The Commodore said, "We here at Command figure on you fellows getting a touch of space cafard once in a while and, imagining something wrong in the engines and coming in. But," here the Commodore cleared his throat, 4 times out of 6? Are you sure you don't need a psych, Lieutenant?" Don Mathers flushed. "No, sir, I don't think so." The Commodore's voice went militarily expressionless. "Very well, Lieutenant. You'll have the customary 3 weeks leave before going out again. Dismissed." Don saluted snappily, wheeled and marched from the office. Outside in the corridor he muttered a curse. What did that chair-borne brass hat know about space cafard? About the depthless blackness, the wretchedness of freefall, the tides of primitive terror that swept you in the animal realization that you were away from the environment that gave you birth, that you were alone, alone, a million miles from your nearest fellow human. Space cafard in a craft little larger than a good-sized closet. What did the Commodore know about it? Don Mathers had conveniently forgotten the other's claim to 5 years' service in the Scouts. He made his way from Space Command Headquarters, 3rd Division, to Harry's Nuevo Mexico bar. He found the place empty at this time of the day and climbed onto a stool. Harry said, "Hi, Lieutenant. Thought you were due for a patrol. How come you're back so soon?" Don said coldly, "You prying into security subjects, Harry?" "Well, gee, no, Lieutenant. You know me. I know all the boys. I was just making conversation." "Look, how about some more credit, Harry? I don't have any pay coming up for a week." "Why, sure. I got a boy on the light cruiser New Taos. Any spaceman's credit is good with me. What'll it be?" Tequila. Tequila was the only concession the Nuevo Mexico bar made to its name. Otherwise, it looked like every other bar had looked in every land and in every era. Harry poured, put out lemon and salt. Harry said, "You hear the news this morning?" "No, I just got in." "Colin Casey died." Harry shook his head. "Only man in the system that held the Galactic Medal of Honor. Presidential proclamation. Everybody in the system is to hold 5 minutes of silence for him at 2 o'clock, Sol time. You know how many times that medal's been awarded, Lieutenant?" Before waiting for an answer, Harry added, "Just 36 times." Don added dryly, 28 of them posthumously. "Yeah," Harry, leaning on the bar before his sole customer, added in wonder. "But imagine, the Galactic Medal of Honor, the bearer of which can do no wrong. Imagine! You come to some town, walk into the biggest jewelry store, and pick up a diamond bracelet, and walk out, and what happens?" Don growled. "The jewelry store owner would be over-reimbursed by popular subscription, and probably the mayor of the town would write you a letter thanking you for honoring his fair city by deigning to notice one of the products of its shops. Just like that." "Yeah," Harry shook his head and continued on. "And imagine, if you shoot somebody you don't like, you wouldn't spend even a single night in the nick." Don said, "If you held the Medal of Honor, you wouldn't have to shoot anybody. Look, Harry, mind if I use the phone?" "Go right ahead, Lieutenant." Diane Fuller was obviously in the process of packing when the screen summoned her. She looked into his face and said, surprised, "Why, Don, I thought you were on patrol." "Yeah, I was. However, something came up." She looked at him, a slight frown on her broad, fine forehead. "Again?" He said impatiently, "Look, I called you to ask for a date. You're leaving for Callisto tomorrow. It's our last chance to be together. There's something in particular I wanted to ask you, Di." She said, a touch irritated, "I'm packing, Don. I simply don't have time to see you again. I thought we said our goodbyes 5 days ago." "This is important, Di." She tossed the 2 sweaters she was holding into a chair or something off screen and faced him, her hands on her hips. "No, it isn't, Don. Not to me, at least. We've been all over this. Why keep torturing yourself? You're not ready for marriage, Don. I don't want to hurt you, but you simply aren't. Look me up, Don, in a few years." "Di, just a couple of hours this afternoon." Diane looked him full in the face and said, "Colin Casey finally died of his wounds this morning. The President has asked for 5 minutes of silence at 2 o'clock, Don. I plan to spend that time here alone in my apartment, possibly crying a few tears for a man who died for me and the rest of the human species under such extreme conditions of gallantry that he was awarded the highest honor of which man has ever conceived. I wouldn't want to spend that 5 minutes while on a date with another member of my race's armed forces who has deserted his post of duty." Don Mathers turned, after the screen had gone blank, and walked stiffly to a booth. He sank onto a chair and called flatly to Harry, "Another tequila. A double tequila. And don't bother with that lemon and salt routine." An hour or so later, a voice said, "You Sub-Lieutenant Donald Mathers?" Don looked up and snarled, "So what? Go away." There were 2 of them, twins, or could have been, empty of expression, heavy of build. The kind of men fated to be ordered around at the pleasure of those with money or brains, none of which they had or would ever have. The one who had spoken said, "The boss wants to see you." "Who the hell is the boss?" "Maybe he'll tell you when he sees you," the other said, patiently and reasonably. "Well, go tell the boss he can go to the—" The second of the 2 had been standing silently, his hands in his greatcoat pockets. Now he brought his left hand out and placed a bill before Don Mathers. "The boss said to give you this." It was a 1,000-unit note. Don Mathers had never seen a bill of that denomination before, nor one of half that. He pursed his lips, picked it up, and looked at it carefully. Counterfeiting was a long-lost art. It didn't even occur to him that it might be false. "All right," Don said, coming to his feet. "Let's go see the boss. I haven't anything else to do, and his calling card intrigues me." At the curb, one of them summoned a cruising cab with his wrist screen, and the three of them climbed into it. The one who had given Don the large denomination bill dialed the address, and they settled back. "So what does the boss want with me?" Don asked. They didn't bother to answer. The Interplanetary Lines building was evidently their destination. The car whisked them up to the penthouse which topped it, and they landed on the terrace. Seated in beach chairs, an auto bar between them, were two men. They were both in their middle years. The impossibly corpulent one Don Mathers vaguely recognized. From a newscast? From a magazine article? The other could have passed for a video stereotype villain, complete to the built-in sneer. Few men in actuality either look or act or sound like the conventional villain. This was an exception, Don decided. He scowled at them. "I suppose one of you is the boss?" he said. "That's right," the fat one grunted. He looked at Don's two escorts. "Scotty, you and Rogers take off." They got back into the car and left. The vicious-faced one said, "This is Mr. Lawrence Demming. I am his secretary." Demming puffed. "Sit down, Lieutenant. What'll you have to drink? My secretary's name is Rostov, Max Rostov. Now we all know each other's names. That is, assuming you're Sub-Lieutenant Donald Mathers." Don said, "Tequila." Max Rostov dialed the drink for him, and, without being asked, another cordial for his employer. Don placed Demming now. Lawrence Demming, billionaire. Robber baron he might have been branded in an earlier age. Transportation baron of the solar system. Had he been a pig, he would have been butchered long ago. He was going unhealthily to Greece. Rostov said, "You have identification?" Don Mathers fingered through his wallet, brought forth his ID card. Rostov handed him his tequila, took the card, and examined it carefully, front and back. Demming huffed and said, "Your color insignia tells me you pilot a scout. What sector do you patrol, Lieutenant?" Don sipped at the fiery Mexican drink, looked at the fat man over the glass. "That's military information, Mr. Demming." Demming made a move with his plump lips. "Did Scotty give you a 1,000-unit note?" He didn't wait for an answer. "You took it. Either give it back or tell me what sector you patrol, Lieutenant." Don Mathers was aware of the fact that a man of Demming's position wouldn't have to go to overmuch effort to acquire such information. Anyway, it wasn't of particular importance. He shrugged and said, "A22, K223. I fly the V102. Max Rostov handed back the ID card to Don and picked up a solar system sector chart from the short-legged table that sat between the two of them and checked it. He said, "Your information was correct, Mr. Demming. He's the man." Demming shifted his great bulk in his beach chair, sipped some of his cordial, and said, "Very well. How would you like to hold the Galactic Medal of Honor, Lieutenant?" Don Mathers laughed. "How would you?" he said. Demming scowled. "I'm not jesting, Lieutenant Mathers. I never jest. Obviously, I am not of the military. It would be quite impossible for me to gain such an award. But you are the pilot of a scout. And I've got just about as much chance of winning the Medal of Honor as I have of giving birth to triplets." The transportation magnate wiggled a disgustingly fat finger at him. "I'll arrange for that part of it?" Don Mathers goggled him. He blurted finally, "Like hell you will. There's not enough money in the system to fiddle with the awarding of the Medal of Honor. There comes a point, Deming, when even your dough can't carry the load." Deming settled back in his chair, closed his eyes, and grunted. "Tell him." Max Rostov took up the ball. "A few days ago, Mr. Deming and I flew in from Io on one of the Interplanetary Line's freighters. As you probably know, they are completely automated. We were alone in the craft." So, without invitation, Don Mathers leaned forward and dialed himself another tequila. He made it a double this time. A feeling of excitement was growing within him, and the drinks he'd had earlier had worn away. Something very big, very, very big was developing. He hadn't the vaguest idea what. "Lieutenant, how would you like to capture a Kraden light cruiser? If I'm not incorrect, probably Miro class?" Don laughed nervously, not knowing what the other was at, but still feeling the growing excitement. He said, "In all the history of the war between our species, we've never captured a Kraden ship intact. It'd help a lot if we could. This one isn't exactly intact, but nearly so." Don looked from Rostov to Deming and then back. "What in the hell are you talking about?" "In your sector," Rostov said, "we ran into a derelict Miro-class cruiser. The crew, repulsive creatures, were all dead, some 30 of them. Mr. Deming and I assumed that the craft had been hit during one of the actions between our fleet and theirs, and that somehow both sides had failed to recover the wreckage. At any rate, today it is floating, abandoned of all life, in your sector," Rostov added softly. "One has to approach quite close before any signs of battle are evident. The ship looks intact." Deming opened his eyes again and said, "And you're going to capture it?" Don Mathers bolted his tequila, licked a final drop from the edge of his lip. "And why should that rate the most difficult decoration to achieve that we've ever instituted?" "Because," Rostov told him, his tone grating mockery, "you're going to radio in reporting a Miro-class Kraden cruiser. We assume your superiors will order you to stand off, that help is coming. Your tiny scout isn't large enough to do anything more than to keep the enemy under observation until a squadron arrives. But you will radio back that they are escaping, and that you plan to attack. When your reinforcements arrive, Lieutenant, you will have conquered the Kraden single-handed against odds of, what would you say, 50 to 1? Don Mathers' mouth was dry, his palms moist. He said, "A one-man scout against a Miro-class cruiser? At least 50 to 1, Mr. Rostov. At least." Deming grunted. "There would be little doubt of you getting the Galactic Medal of Honor, Lieutenant. Especially since Colin Casey is dead and there isn't a living bearer of the award. Max, another drink for the lieutenant." Don said, "Look, why? I think you might be right about getting the award, but why? And why me? And what's your percentage?" Deming muttered, "Now we get to the point." He settled back in his chair again and closed his eyes while his secretary took over. Max Rostov leaned forward, his wolfish face very serious. "Lieutenant, the exploitation of the Jupiter satellites is in its earliest stages. There is every reason to believe that the new sources of radioactives on Callisto alone may mean the needed power edge that can give us the victory over the Kradens. Whether or not that is so, someone is going to make literally billions out of this new frontier. I still don't see. Lieutenant Mathers, Rostov said patiently, the bearer of the Galactic Medal of Honor is above law. He carries with him an unalienable prestige of such magnitude that, well, let me use an example. Suppose a bearer of the Medal of Honor formed a stock corporation to exploit the pitch blende of Callisto. How difficult would it be for him to dispose of the stock? Deming grunted. And suppose there were a few, crossed wires in the manipulation of the corporation's business? He sighed deeply. Believe me, Lieutenant Mathers, there are an incredible number of laws which have accumulated down through the centuries to hamper the businessman. It is a continual fight to be able to carry on at all. The ability to do no legal wrong would be priceless in the development of a new frontier. He sighed again, so deeply as to make his bulk quiver. Priceless. Rostov laid it on the line, his face a leer. We are offering you a three-way partnership, Mathers. You, with your Medal of Honor, are our front man. Mr. Deming supplies the initial capital to get underway, and he twisted his mouth with evil self-satisfaction. I was present when the Kraden ship was discovered, and so I'll have to be cut in. I'll supply the brains. Deming grunted his disgust, but added nothing. Don Mathers said slowly, looking down at the empty glass he was twirling in his fingers, Look, we're up to our necks in a war to the death with the Kradens. In the long run, it's either us or them. At a time like this, you're suggesting that we fake an action that will eventually enable us to milk the new satellites to the tune of billions? Deming grunted meaninglessly. Don said, The theory is that all men, all of us, ought to have our shoulders to the wheel. This project sounds to me like throwing rocks under it. Deming closed his eyes. Rostov said, Lieutenant, it's a dog-eat-dog society. If we eventually lick the Kradens, one of the very reasons will be because we're a dog-eat-dog society. Every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost. Our apologists dream up some beautiful gobbledygook phrases for it, such as free enterprise, but actually, it's dog-eat-dog. Surprisingly enough, it works, or at least has so far. Right now, the human race needs the radioactives of the Jupiter satellites. In acquiring them, somebody is going to make a tremendous amount of money. Why shouldn't it be us? Why not, if you or we can do it honestly? Deming's grunt was nearer a snort this time. Rostov said sourly, Don't be naive, Lieutenant. Whoever does it is going to need little integrity. You don't win in a sharper's card game by playing your cards honestly. The biggest sharper wins. We've just found a joker somebody dropped on the floor. If we don't use it, we're suckers. Deming opened his pig eyes and said, All this is on the academic side. We checked your background thoroughly before approaching you, Mathers. We know your record, even before you entered the space service. Just between the three of us, wouldn't you like out? There are a full 1 billion men and women in our armed forces. You can be spared. Let's say you've already done your share. Can't you see the potentialities in spending the rest of your life with the Galactic Medal of Honor in your pocket? It was there all right, drifting slowly. Had he done a more thorough job of his patrol last time, he should have stumbled upon it himself. If he had, there was no doubt that he would have at first reported it as an active enemy cruiser. Deming and Rostov had been right. The Kraden ship looked untouched by battle. That is, if you approached it from the starboard and slightly abaft the beam. From that angle in particular, it looked untouched. It had taken several circlings of the craft to come to that conclusion. Don Mathers was playing it very safe. This thing wasn't quite so simple as the others had thought. He wanted no slip-ups. His hand went to a food compartment and emerged with a space thermos which should have contained fruit juice, but didn't. He took a long pull at it. Finally, he dropped back into the position he'd decided upon and flicked the switch on his screen. A base lieutenant's face illuminated it. He yawned and looked questioningly at Don Mathers. Don said, allowing a touch of excitement in his voice, "Mathers, Scout V-102, Sector A22-K223. Yeah, the other began, still yawning. "I've spotted a Kraden cruiser, Miro class, I think." The lieutenant flashed into movement. He slapped a button before him. The screen blinked to be lit immediately again. A gray-haired fleet admiral looked up from papers on his desk. "Yes?" Don Mathers rapped. "Miro-class Kraden in Sector A22-K223, sir. I'm lying about 50 miles off, undetected thus far, I think. He hasn't fired on me yet, at least." The admiral was already doing things with his hands. Two subalterns came within range of the screen, took orders, dashed off. The admiral was rapidly firing orders into two other screens. After a moment, he looked up at Don Mathers again. "Hang on, Lieutenant. Keep him under observation as long as you can. What are your exact coordinates?" Don gave them to him and waited. A few minutes later, the admiral returned to him. "Let's take a look at it, Lieutenant." Don Mathers adjusted the screen to relay the Kraden cruiser. His palms were moist now, but everything was going to plan. He wished that he could take another drink. The admiral said, "Miro class, all right. Don't get too close, Lieutenant. They'll blast you to hell and gone. We've got a task force within an hour of you. Just hang on." "Yes, sir," Don said. An hour. He was glad to know that. He didn't have much time in which to operate. He let it go another 5 minutes, then he said, "Sir, they're increasing speed." "Damn," the admiral said, then rapid-fired some more into his other screens, barking one order after another. Don, letting his voice go very flat. "I'm going in, sir. They're putting on speed. In another 5 minutes, they'll be underway to a point where I won't be able to follow. They'll get completely clear." The admiral looked up, startled. "Don't be a fool." "They'll get away, sir." Knowing that the other could see his every motion, Don Mathers hit the cocking lever of his flak-flak gun with the heel of his right hand. The admiral snapped, "Let it go, you fool. You won't last a second." Then, his voice higher, "That's an order, Lieutenant." Don Mathers flicked off his screen. He grimaced sourly and then descended on the Kraden ship, his flak-flak gun beaming it. He was going to have to expend every erg of energy in his scout to burn the other ship up to the point where his attack would look authentic, and to eliminate all signs of previous action. The awarding of the Galactic Medal of Honor, as always, was done in the simplest of ceremonies. Only the President and Captain Donald Mathers himself were present in the former's office in the presidential palace. However, as they both knew, every screen in the solar system was tuned into the ceremony. Don Mathers saluted and stood to attention. The President read the citation. It was very short, as Medal of Honor citations were always. "For conspicuous gallantry for and beyond the call of duty, in which you single-handedly and against unbelievable odds attacked and destroyed an enemy cruiser while flying a scout armed only with a short-beam flak-flak gun." He pinned a small bit of ribbon and metal to Don Mathers' tunic. It was an inconspicuous, inordinately ordinary medal, the Galactic Medal of Honor. Don said hoarsely, "Thank you, sir." The President shook hands with him and said, I am President of the United Solar System, Captain Mathers. Supposedly the highest rank to which a man can attain. He added simply, I wish I were you. End of Part 1 of Medal of Honor.